It's now 7 o'clock. We'll call this planning meeting to order. This is the Hastings Planning Commission. Today is November 9th, 2019. This is a regular meeting. First item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes from our November 12th meeting. Commissioners, any corrections or additions to the minutes? If not, do we have a motion for approval?
Make a motion to approve the minutes.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Minutes are approved. We have a couple of public hearings this evening. The first one is the ordinance amendment, historic apartments in R2 zoning district. Staff report by Mr. Fortney.
Thank you very much. Within Hastings and similar communities, there are large historic structures that may not find a use for their original intended purpose. These properties include mansions, convents, shelters, bed and breakfast, hospital, school, church, funeral home, and others. They're rarely purchased as private residences. In Hastings, we have several vacant properties of these types. As many neighbors are aware, these sites have recently been proposed for uses such as homeless shelters, drug and alcohol treatment centers, and home occupation, including many uses similar to a museum, library, meeting space, community center, and possibly some other uses. Neighbors have opposed these types of uses, and many have stated that they understand these buildings are unique and they would expect a use other than a private residence to go in them. But they want them to be of residential character and not detrimental to the area. The R2 zoning district found in the heart of Hastings is predominantly a residential neighborhood, allowing single and two-family dwelling homes, along with some other unlikely uses for some of these properties, including school, church, library, park, country club, fire station, cemetery, residential care facility, and bed and breakfast with special conditions for that use. Although not allowed by city ordinance, overriding state statutes require that cities not bar or regulate group homes for the disabled. Addiction to drugs and alcohol is legally considered a disability, and we're mandated to allow group homes for those uses for up to 16 individuals. They're not required to apply for permission or notify the city, and the number of these group homes in the city, especially in the R2 district, has been increasing in the past several years. And looking for compatible uses for these buildings that won't negatively impact the neighborhood, staff is proposing a procedure for allowing additional dwelling units approved on an individual basis with a public hearing and neighborhood notification. This idea certainly isn't new. There's many of these examples currently in the city, and also in cities like Hastings. I looked at several of these properties and found that the ones that we have currently are locally owned, have no history of code violations or property maintenance complaints. While this doesn't guarantee future performance for similar properties, it also causes little reason for fear. Many historic cities have a procedure for approving these without issue, including Minneapolis and Stillwater. These are some examples of apartment buildings developed into historic properties in the city of Hastings. 401 Ramsey Street, 612 Vermillion Street, 111 3rd Street West, 220 3rd Street West, and 807 Vermillion Street. This proposal was recently shared with the HPC, the Heritage Preservation Commission. They were supportive of its adoption. In fact, the chair of the HPC, who has just moved out of town, said she wished she would have adopted this a month earlier. Her husband had been attempting to renovate sell his renovated duplex for over a year, Only investors were interested in the property, but none of them were able to obtain a return on investment for the property because it was just two very large units in the duplex. Buyers that were proposing to purchase the property checked with the city and found that no more units would be allowed in the property, and couldn't cash flow with just the two units, especially with the large size of the building. The owner had just received an offer prior to our meeting by an entity proposing to use the property as a drug and alcohol group home for 12 individuals. They were legally bound to accept the full price offer without taking the property off the market, which they couldn't afford to do. The property is across the street from, it's at 202 and 200 7th Street East. It's across from the funeral home, kitty corner from the bed and breakfast, and a block away from C's school. The proposal includes adding a special use permit for residential reuse of structures meeting certain requirements. All special use permits require a hearing and neighborhood notification. The provisions for the special use permit would be as follows. The facility shall be part of a formally designated local, state, or national structure. The dwelling units shall be established within the principal structure, which would bar the structure from being torn down and having an apartment building built in its place or other units on the site. The number of units would be required dependent on the amount of off-street parking as required by the parking loading requirements. Currently, that's 2 spaces per unit. The structure shall have a minimum size of 4,000 finished square feet. The lot shall have a minimum area of 9,000 square feet. Special use permit application to be reviewed by the Heritage Preservation Commission as required by the preservation ordinance for the City of Hastings. The necessary and approved changes are made to the structure with all applicable building permits and payment of fees. Dwelling units shall be determined as follows. 1 residential dwelling unit per 1,000 square feet of finished structure size shall be allowed. An additional 1,800 square feet of lot size shall be required for any additional unit in excess of 5. Those proposals for the number of units in the building would generally allow those buildings to have a similar density to the other historic apartment houses that we have in Hastings currently. And 2 minor changes would be to the residential lot regulations section of the ordinance. The top one is just striking some zoning districts that were developed, and they don't relate to anything else in the ordinance. And that placing a note in the R2 district that mentions this use permit available as a use in the district. It would just let people know to check that section for that information. Public hearing notice is required to be in the paper. We did mail a notice to area residents within 350 feet of many of these properties that could take advantage of this special use permit as a courtesy. And I did receive some information from some residents based on that notice. I did get a few calls from residents that were just looking for some additional information, and they didn't offer any additional feedback. I got a call from Terry Whipple at 314 5th Street East. She's across the alley from the Harbor Shelter. She said that she has to be opposed to everything. She said the shelter has been a nightmare with lack of privacy, individuals mocking her when she's in her backyard. There's area drug sales and transients walking through her property and throwing up in her yard from other area uses. She would accept a single-family home or even a duplex at the shelter. Roger Tonsiger at 706 4th Street West said he was aged 92, and he was the first building inspector for the City of Hastings. He provided a wealth of information about the city's municipal history and said that he's not opposed to the proposal as long as there's a requirement to utilize the existing building and each proposal is individually reviewed. Wesley Lund at 120 7th Street East said it's an understandable as a reuse for a historic building in Hastings. He lives kitty corner from a Kateria Schmidt Funeral Home building, and his biggest worry is that it'll be demolished and a commercial apartment building would be constructed there. Christina, who withheld her name and address for privacy reasons, said she just wants the area to be safe. She doesn't want people with criminal backgrounds and drugs to be in the area because of safety for the neighborhood and the school. She would support a women's shelter and an apartment if the renters had a background check performed. Dennis Piney, a Hedra commissioner, said he is not opposed as long as the property maintenance codes are enforced and there should be rental inspections more often than they are required for commercial apartments, which is once every 2 years. And with that, this is a public hearing required for ordinance amendment, but I'd be also happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Justin. We'll open the public hearing now, and if anybody would like to come up and speak, please come to the podium and give your name, state your name and address for the record.
Hi, Rebecca Vlack, 1007 Sibley Street. So my question would be, if we did not fulfill the 9,000 square foot lot requirement, what happens to ours then? I mean, would we still get a special use permit? Because we have right now like a triplex.
Well, whatever you have right now wouldn't be affected by this. The only thing that would be affected is you'd be able to apply for whatever is approved as a proposal, if anything.
So
Anything you have now wouldn't be taken away or changed.
So we're grandfathered in, but this is an investment property for us, and eventually we'll want to sell as an investment property. Will that grandfathered, whatever we have that's been grandfathered also be transferred in the title?
Yeah, that's not affected by this. Anything that's grandfathered would remain a viable option for somebody as long as that use didn't cease for a period of 6 months.
Okay. So what would affect us with this change? How would this affect us?
Well, first of all, I believe your property probably does have 9,000 square feet of lot area.
Yeah, I don't. It's 6,200 square foot home, but I'm not sure about the lot size.
Yeah,
It's not a huge lot.
9,000 square feet is not a huge lot,
Okay,
certainly not.
okay. Because I think that's the only thing that would be affecting us as far as our investment.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't know, but, so. But in none of these proposed ordinances then would change anything that we're doing?
No one's compelled to do anything differently by this proposed amendment. Would allow an extra avenue for you to explore for a use.
Okay, okay. But it wouldn't restrict, because I read in the proposal that many staff said that many of these properties would not fit the requirements of the proposal.
Correct. There's not many properties that could meet all these requirements for building size, lot size, and being designated as historic.
Okay,
I honestly do believe that your property meets all of them.
okay,
So this is something, if it was approved, you could apply for. But if you didn't wish to apply for it, it wouldn't affect you in any way.
okay, okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Justin, would that be including the parking?
Sorry,
It would be including the parking for the property?
what would,
You just said that you felt like all of the criteria there would,
whatever they're doing on their property, if they're grandfathered in, they can keep doing that no matter what we do to our codes. That's the whole premise behind grandfathering is they're allowed to continue to do something even though the code is changing.
yeah, if the grandfather fell off. If the grandfather fell off, do they have adequate parking?
is the proposal for the grandfathered properties to go away?
No, maybe I can offer some clarification on this as well here. What Justin says is correct on that. What is being proposed by this code amendment here does not have any effect on any properties that are currently grandfathered in. So for example, with your property there, I believe it's grandfathered in as a triplex. That could continue to be used as a triplex. That would not change. With this ordinance amendment that we have here, it would be specifically for historic homes that are within historic districts that are at least 4,000 square feet, that have to meet those criteria, have to be over 4,000 square feet. If that's the case, then they have the opportunity to have additional residential units within the structure itself.
So John, if we sold the property, say, for use in 5 years from now, is it triplex, we could certainly sell it as a triplex.
Yeah, the question being asked here is if you have a triplex now and it's grandfathered in, could it be sold in the future as a triplex still? Yep, and I would say yes. The only condition on that is it has to have a continual use on it. I think as Justin had mentioned, I think it's a 6-month period. If the use doesn't occur for a period of 6 months or greater, that grandfather entitlement is lost at that point. But other than that, it would not have this ordinance amendment would not have an effect.
Anybody else like to come to the podium?
My name's Fred Weiland. I live at 413 2nd Street West. My question is on this B, that all dwelling units shall be established within the principal structure. The house I have has been used in the past as a triplex. Currently, I'm using it as a single-family residence. Looking for long-term, I plan to stay here another 30 years. And so there's been thoughts about adding on to the structure actually to create a upstairs apartment with a separate entry, which is the big problem I have now, is everything is through common areas of the house. The house really isn't set up to be a bed and breakfast. It may look large, but it really isn't when you get inside. So with this principal structure, I mean, is that going to limit me from kicking a wall out and adding on to the back of the house?
I believe if it's part of the main structure, you should be able to do it as long as you weren't proposing to do a big apartment addition onto it.
Well, a lot of this is going to be to go up over the top of areas where there are flat roofs now, and to get rid of those watershed problems that exist, and utilize that space going up then.
Yeah. A lot of these structures have had a lot of additions over the years. If it's part of the main structure, it would be allowed. Currently, under the existing zoning, you can have 2 units on your property without any of this.
Right, but physically, the way the house is laid out, unless it gets altered, it's not going to work.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you.
My name is Wes Lund at 120 East 7th Street. I'm the one kitty corner from the former funeral home. I've got a couple of questions just to maybe get a little more clarification here. So what I'm first of all trying to understand is, how is what you're proposing here different from how it functions today? What's the differences we're looking at?
Today, in a structure on a property that's 9,700 square feet, you can have 2 units. Otherwise, you can just have 1 unit. These properties are, the subject ones that we're talking about are fairly large. Having 1 or 2 residential units in there isn't something that has been shown to be feasible for possible purchasers. So what this would allow more units somewhere, probably depending on the size and amount of parking they could provide off the street, would be, I'd guess, between 4 and 8 units. And so it would allow these buildings to be developed inside with that many apartment buildings and parking on the site.
Well, it seems to me that we've already had several proposals for some of these buildings that we've gone through a more public process. It's sounding like this is to change this public process. Will this proposal remove this happening, public hearing and public notification that this is going to happen at a property?
Currently, if somebody would want to put 5 apartments in one of these structures, they couldn't do it. There's not a avenue to do that.
They couldn't come for a special use permit?
Nope, they could only come and ask for the ordinance to be amended.
Okay.
What we're doing is thinking ahead, saying if this is something that we would support, why don't we amend the ordinance at this point to put in place a process where this could occur. And so what we've put forward would be a process which includes neighborhood notification and a public hearing where the request would be made.
Okay, so that would still happen, because I mean, we had that at the funeral home where there was a special use permit request, and we had the opportunity to give feedback on it. So that isn't going to be eliminated with the amendment that we're talking about here.
It would be a similar
Similar kind of process.
procedure as that home occupation is.
So then, another question I have is, this is the first I've learned that I'm going to have 12 people living next door to me at the 200-207. And I know Pam, and I work in the mental health field, and I know the demand for group homes and chemical dependency issues. So I'm quite glad that there's more resources coming online. However, on the other hand, does the city have occupancy code? I mean, how many people can actually reside in a facility? Because I know they do in Minneapolis. I've bumped into that when we used to live up there. But does the city of Hastings have that? Is there a maximum number of people that can live in a home?
What we have is adopted the International Property Maintenance Code, which has minimum square footage listed for different types of rooms, including bedrooms. And when these types of proposals are made, either the fire department or the building safety department will do an inspection and basically come up with a allowable occupancy for them.
Okay, so the answer is no. We don't really have an occupancy limit for a residential facility.
Not other than what is based on size of rooms from the International Property Maintenance Code.
Yeah, and I'll qualify that a little bit to Mr. Lund as well. I mean, Justin's correct. I mean, we have those minimum requirements for property maintenance and building code for sizes. We also have a zoning code, which is further limiting than that as far as the number of structures. The building code may say, you look at a house, you can have 20 people in there. The zoning code right now says, depending on the size of the property, you could have up to 2 legally. So there's a difference on that end of things between occupancy from a building code or a property maintenance standpoint and what we have within our zoning code.
Well, and I remember, this will be dating things, but back when we lived in Minneapolis, we were involved in the resettling of boat people, and that was all going on. And when we were putting families into homes in Minneapolis, it was one of the things we had to pay attention to, was you couldn't have more than X number of people in any building per code in the city. I'm just curious if we had one as well. We may be considering that down the road, I would think, but we'll see. So I'm just curious, the properties you listed in the material that was online, which, by the way, I guess we're an electronic society, because the notice I got at home was pretty sparse, you know, to know what I was even going to be coming down here for. And I think about some of my elderly neighbors who aren't exactly online. It would have been nice to have gotten it all in the mail rather than just that very sparse announcement of what's going on today. But I'm curious, can you give me an idea of what, like you mentioned in here, the Thorwood's been sold. And I remember they had a sign up not that long ago before the fire that they were selling condos there, as I remember. And I thought, I wondered how Pam and Dick were doing that. And then secondly, I'm wondering, if this passes and we go along, what's it going to look like? I mean, how many units might be in there, and what's that, or if we have another one of the buildings? It helps me to kind of visualize if I could understand how a couple of these facilities might look, if you can do that.
Well, the Thorwood, they had condo units in there, 3 of them.
Okay.
They rented them out for vacation rental by owner. It had previously, before they bought it, it was a 6-unit apartment building.
They've been a hospital, too. I know people have been born there.
Right. So, like the regulations are proposed to state, it'd be 1 unit per 1,000 square feet. So, if the building was, 4,000 square feet, it could have 4 units as long as they could have 8 parking spaces available, which would limit some of them. Like the bed and breakfast on Ramsey Street is a pretty small property. There's not a lot of room for parking. That might be their limiting factor. Some, like the Thorwood, is probably the largest.
Yeah.
At over 10,000 square feet. They could possibly have 10. I don't think that would fit in the building or with parking. And the lot might not be large enough for that because then another 1,800 square feet beyond the 9,000 is required for an additional 1.
Okay. Thank you for the information. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Eric Train, 651 3rd Street West. My backyard looks onto the mansion that had the fire 2 years ago. And I'm generally supportive of efforts to, if someone can restore that building in its current form and sight lines, then I think that would be a wonderful thing. And it's my sight lines that my question has to do with, which is, the way the provision's written, I don't see any problem with it, but item B, for example, mentions all dwelling units shall be established within the principal structure. There's no comment on parking other than parking on the street. So are there any changes to ancillary buildings, parking structures, et cetera, that would be allowed for with this zoning change?
Well, they'd be required to have 2 spaces per unit. That would be the requirement through this. All these properties are designated historic properties, so any exterior change to the appearance is going to have to be approved by the HPC.
Okay, because item B mentions dwelling units within the principal structure, and this home on Pine Street, that my backyard looks onto, has a detached garage, which is lovely. And if that were to change to a high-rise parking structure, for example, that would not be a desirable thing from a sightline standpoint, is what I'm getting at. Or if there were any changes that allowed building closer to my property, for example.
Sure. Well, the Heritage Preservation Design Guidelines wouldn't allow that garage to be converted into a high-rise parking structure.
Okay.
That I can tell you for sure. As far as other buildings being closer to your property, it's going to be a matter of design review by the HPC. Generally, they try to keep any new buildings setbacks consistent with the surrounding area, and then there's zoning code requirements for setbacks. I'm not sure what you're thinking of for additional buildings. It wouldn't be for apartment buildings.
No, it'd be parking.
Parking, yeah. I just imagine most of the parking is always going to be outside. I don't think anyone would be able to afford to build any kind of a parking ramp or anything like that.
And again, it's, my backyard looks onto the property, and it's an attractive property.
Sure.
And I'm hoping that someone can restore that. But if part of the restoration happened to include some ugly parking structure separate from the principal structure, then that would negatively impact my quality of life.
Sure.
So,
And if they decide to apply for something like this, if it were approved, you'd be given a notice for that meeting where it would be considered, and at that time, they would have to show the commission and the HPC and the neighbors and council what their proposal is, and you could see what kind of facilities they're proposing, and you could voice any concerns regarding those at that time, along with the regular review required by the HPC.
Okay,
for
so
new
nothing in this current bill allows for any building closer to my property. It doesn't mention ancillary structures as part of why I'm asking.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, it doesn't, it
So
just, it states.
implicit in this, is it that no change? I mean, because, okay, I used to live in Denmark Township. There was a limit on the number of ancillary structures and the size of ancillary structures, for example.
Yeah, this doesn't give them, wouldn't give any property owner the ability to do anything that others can't do as far as new structures for parking or anything like that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Robert Albright. I don't live in Hastings now, but I have lived here for many years. I currently don't live here now, but my question is, I'm at a loss for the answer. Perhaps you can clarify it for me. In a property that is on the National Register of Deeds, what is the rule or regulation for changing, or can't you change the outside, the exterior appearance of the building? I think you can the interior, but I'm not sure about the exterior. Could you clarify that for me, please?
Yeah, if a property is on the National Register of Historic Properties, they are regulated by the local preservation ordinance in Hastings. All those have been locally adopted as preservation sites, and so any exterior change would have to be approved. If any federal money is being used on the property, then Section 106 review is required, and the State Preservation Office would have to review what's being done to the property, both externally and internal to the building.
Thank you. That was the answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments?
Yeah, just a quick one. The special use permit, is there going to be any fees involved with that?
Yeah, we have a fee schedule. I think it's $500 for a special use permit.
Hi, good evening. My name is Jesse Starkson, and I own the funeral home that's been mentioned on 201 East 7th Street. So I just have a couple questions for clarification. So in particular, pointing out for the 200 and 202 property that was recently sold. So there's 12 residents moving in there, is that correct?
That's what we've been told, correct.
Okay, so I have not been in there. So when you talk about that capacity of livable space, is it common kitchen, is it common bathrooms, or does a remodel have to take place so it's 12 individual studio apartments with all facilities for each resident?
For that particular use, generally it's one dwelling unit and multiple bedrooms.
So for all these other properties that are listed, let's just talk about the bed and breakfast that's next door to the funeral home. So are they able to do the same then, or how do you guys make that jurisdiction? Because I don't see any of that classification in any of the presented
Yeah.
items.
So for this proposal, it would allow one dwelling unit per 1,000 square feet, and a dwelling unit in the ordinance is defined as one complete living space with their own kitchen facilities and everything. So it would be separate apartment units. They wouldn't have shared facilities.
But that's not a requirement at 200 and 202 East 7th Street then?
That's correct. That's guided by state statutes that require us to allow any state licensed group home for disabilities for up to 6 individuals without a special use permit. That duplex is 2 separate dwelling units, and so by state statute requirements, they're allowed to have up to 6 people in each unit without any review by the city.
Okay. So just to clarify, if it's a state licensed sort of group home facility, common living space is legally a capability up to how many square feet our location permits, is that correct?
Right. State statute requires us to not have any review or approval process as long as it's up to 6. And between 6 and 16, they can do that in a district that's considered a multifamily district, like the R2 district. Although we are able to have them go through a special use permit process for that, which we do. But we aren't able to regulate the number of people.
So somebody that's a resident of a state licensed group home, is the parking capacity considered at that point? Or if they're assumed that they're part of that parking, these restrictions for parking would not be allowed then? Is that?
Correct. There's no ability for us to restrict it based on parking. In fact, they don't notify us ahead of time or even afterwards.
So you could have no parking and have a state licensed facility in one of any of these properties that meet the other criteria?
Correct.
And parking would not be a consideration?
Correct. So far, many of the properties that have been used for this use haven't had a lot of vehicles there. Oftentimes, they're not allowed to drive or to have vehicles, personal vehicles. But that's not saying that it couldn't happen.
So my other question within R2, if it is a business, isn't there supposed to be the owner as a home occupancy? As previous discussions with the proposed 3 purchasers of my former location, to my understanding, it was a main requirement that whoever was going to own and operate some sort of business, which I assume if it's a state license, that would be a business. So an owner is not now required to live on site, is that?
It's a group home is not a home occupation. It's a living situation. It's a home. In these cases, it's a home for people with disabilities. And even if we wanted to consider it a business, because it's the business model of the owner, the state statute wouldn't allow us to have any type of a review procedure in place for it.
So even though it is a business and money's being transacted for people to stay there, it's not a business classification? Is that?
I guess what we're saying here, Mr. Starkson, is there's an exemption or state statutes for group licensed facilities and homes. I mean, our ability to regulate those locally within our local land use codes, we do not have that ability. And so as far as definitions for home occupations and other things that we normally would regulate, they're not applicable in these situations. That's the way the exemption is written.
Okay. And then the last question I had is, like any of these notifications that go out, what is the time frame so that we have time to respond if somebody were to request?
We are required to send them out 10 days prior to a hearing where a notice is required.
Okay. I know I had received a phone call from one of the commissioners. I hadn't received this letter 10 days prior. Is there reason for that? I just want to make sure we all obtain.
This was a courtesy notice. It was sent out after the weekend of the 10 days, so it was sent out probably 8 days prior to it. I talked to somebody just yesterday who said they had just got it in the mail. I can't.
Right, I know. I was talking with some people that I was sitting with, and they hadn't received it until a few days prior. And I just want to make sure that the notification is out there, and that I guess moving forward, that's done properly. Is that the assumption, though? Is that?
Well, I think there's 2 things that we're getting at here. Number one, there's the legal responsibility for us to provide notification, which is the 10 days, which is not applicable in this situation for individual notification. We follow the rules that we need to follow for notification. In this process, we set out a courtesy notice in addition to that. When we have the situation coming up, if this ordinance was to go forward, we would be legally required to send out a notice at least 10 days prior. In this situation, it would have, looking back, yeah, it would have been helpful to have it out earlier, certainly. But from a legal standpoint, not necessary. We also have another opportunity beyond this if the Planning Commission does vote to move this forward. that there'll be another public hearing on the ordinance itself before city council, so a couple of opportunities.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments? If not, I will close the public hearing. Commissioners, any comments, questions?
Mr. Chair,
Question? Oh, sorry.
Commissioner Barrs?
Justin, could you elaborate for us on the comment about HPC's review for exterior changes? So is there a restriction for the district on the size of the addition, regardless of federal funds being used? Do they have any restrictions on that?
They don't. It's got to be compatible with the architecture of the building, compatible with the streetscape. It shouldn't cause unnecessary damage to original fabric of the structure. Generally, it's not allowed in principal elevations. But as far as size goes, that's more dependent on the zoning ordinance.
And then just one other question, as far as the discussion around the potential group home project coming forward, I mean, that's really independent of what we're talking about here, right? I mean, that has nothing to do with what we're proposing here and unrelated to the topic,
That's correct.
Okay. That's all, thank you.
I got a quick question.
Commissioner Johnson?
You know, I know you pointed out these multiple units that sort of fall into this category. At the same time, we're mentioning historic homes and historic districts. What defines a historic home, or, you know what I mean?
It would have to be part of a formally designated local, state, or national historic structure. The city of Hastings has a list of locally designated heritage preservation sites, and it's recorded on the home's deeds. That's essentially all of them. We've designated all of the National Register properties as local sites, and the state generally doesn't do any type of designation on their own.
So in the R2 section, we're talking about, this is the list? Or are there other historic homes?
Yeah, there could be others. They would have to meet all those requirements.
Right.
What I had highlighted up there with that duplex that recently sold as a group home,
Yep.
that one I didn't have listed because I didn't know that it met all the requirements, because when I looked through building size, it came up as a 2,000 something and a 3,000 something square foot building, because there's a property line running through it. But it does certainly meet the requirements because it's over 5,000 square feet. So there could be other things like that, or errors in data that the county has, or any number of things.
Okay, yeah, so this list is not conclusive.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Martin?
Justin, do you know, I had an email as well from a resident over the weekend, and I know it sounds like you had one from a resident that raised some concerns about illegal activity going on in the district. Is the police department still utilizing crime-free multi-housing program to educate landlords on background checks, thoroughly vetting tenants, things like that? Are you guys aware of that?
I have no knowledge, yeah. I have no knowledge about that program,
Okay.
and if it's still being done.
Okay. I know it's been 12 years ago now when I interned there at the PD. They were actively doing work with that. From what I recall, it was educating landlords on how to conduct background checks, structuring leases and things that would, ward off potential issues. So, and I know, speaking from experience as a former police officer, crime happens everywhere. Doesn't matter what part of town you're in. The types of people that some may think commit crime. So I don't think that concern is really pertinent to this. I'm in support of it. I think it's a great option for property owners to utilize and bolster for sales and things down the line, so.
Justin, I'm curious, you said that this is, ordinance is similar to other historic cities like Minneapolis and Stillwater, they already have those in place. Are the provisions similar to what they have in their ordinance as well, as far as size and everything?
No, in fact, when I said that, I didn't mean the procedures are similar, but the end result is similar.
Okay.
Both Minneapolis and Stillwater approve this type of use by a type of variance. Stillwater doesn't have anything written to guide it at all. Minneapolis actually does have some guiding requirements, but generally we're not real supportive of doing this through a variance process. We think it's better to have all the stipulations and regulations written out ahead of time. Also, this could be considered as a use variance, and which aren't allowed by state statute. I think some other cities might do them and consider them to be more of a variance to the density. But I think you're standing on better legal footing if you have a special use permit process laid out rather than a variance process.
Thank you. Commissioners, any other questions, concerns? If not, do we have a motion?
I have a question.
Commissioner.
Going back to the notification and what's required in a situation like this, I think you said what wasn't required, but what is required?
Putting a notice in the paper for the public hearing.
Okay, and that needs to come, is that a 10-day thing also?
Yep, and that was certainly done.
Okay, so that was a week ago Wednesday? I'm sorry, Thursday? A week ago Thursday's paper? The Hastings Star Gazette a week ago Thursday?
Yes, not this past Thursday, but yes, the week before
Week
last,
before.
yes.
Okay. I've got a question about the Van Dyke building. Does that has two structures, correct? And then the secondary structure, not the principal structure, that also has apartments in it?
I believe so. It's been a while since I've been over there. I know the building also has a big addition, but I think it does have another building on the side. And I don't know the history on that structure, the age of that. It wouldn't be allowed to be, through this proposed ordinance, a structure like that wouldn't be able to be built for this. If it was a historic structure on the site, it could be utilized.
Yeah, it looks historic. I mean, the age looks like it's been quite some time. Before my day anyways. So I'd like to just kind of summarize and make sure that the summary in my head is the reality of what this is. This only comes into play if a grandfather doesn't exist. Is that correct?
Well, with or without a grandfather of a use, they could apply for this.
Sure.
The Vlaches that were here with a grandfather triplex,
Yeah.
they could apply for this if it was approved, if they wanted to do this type of
Change.
use rather than what they've got there.
Change of use. Sure. And that's like anything in the city. You want to do something different than what your grandfather to do, or if there's, you're able to. So this is going to help, this is going to help if, like, properties that don't have a grandfather and are trying to sell, to be able to get buyers in, and they will know before purchasing that they can put, no, they don't know anything new prior to purchasing.
Well, they know
If
this,
they want a different use.
correct. They know this is an avenue they could explore. They could even do it contingent on the sale if they wanted to.
Okay, so they can, so I think that happened not too long ago with Kateria. That gentleman came, said what he wanted to do. He wasn't the owner of the property, but he was trying to get a special use permit prior to owning.
Well, technically not a special use permit. It was a license for home occupation, but very similar thing, sure.
Okay, because he would occupy, so the difference would be him occupying the home. Okay.
Any other questions?
Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Johnson?
Item C, parking, right? Was that, and I didn't get a chance to go back and look, but that didn't change. It was always may depend, may be dependent? Was that, is there a reason intentionally, everything else is shall? Is there a reason we went with may on that particular item?
I'm sorry?
Item C, under the special provisions,
Yeah.
the number of parking units may be dependent on the amount of off-street parking. Everything else, every one of these other requirements, it looks like shells to me. Shall.
Shall,
Okay.
I thought you were saying shall.
Sorry.
Yes, they're required to have off-street parking per the parking loaner requirements. What it's saying is that the number of units, they're not going to be guaranteed the 1 unit per 1,000 square feet because they have to meet their parking requirements. So let's say they have 4,000 square foot building. That doesn't mean they can have, they're guaranteed 4 apartment units if they can only provide parking for 3 units.
Well, when I read that, it says the number of units is dependent on the parking.
May be dependent.
May, am I confused about this?
Well, it may be dependent on something else. May be dependent on the square footage of the building.
I understand, okay.
So
One of
it's-
the, all right. I was interpreting that as parking is optional.
No.
Yeah,
I see.
right, see what I mean?
Yeah.
All right.
But the number of units shall be dependent on the amount of off-street parking.
The number of units is dependent on the square footage. It is dependent on something that may be a function of parking as well.
Yes.
I'm with you now.
Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Bartz?
Just to piggyback on the summary here, I mean, so really what we're talking about here is a mechanism to allow higher density for problematic properties that haven't been able to sell in the market because they're 4,000 feet bigger and it can only have 2 units where, I mean, just financially, that does not work as an investment property. So this is a tool to allow those properties to, if they can meet the criteria, hit higher densities. That's the goal.
Essentially, yes.
Commissioners? We have a motion on the,
Mr. Chair,
Commissioner Martin.
I'd like to make a motion. Motion to move forward to council, support in ordinance amendment 2019-27.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
We have a second. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Motion carries. Justin, the next steps on this one?
Yes, this will be going to City Council December 16th, just to order a public hearing. The actual public hearing for the City Council would be on January, is it 6th? January 6th.
Thank you. Our next public hearing is the ordinance amendment for the original Hastings design standards by Mr. Hensman.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Planning Commissioners. What we have before you tonight is a public hearing to consider an ordinance amendment to Chapter 155 of the zoning code. This would be pertaining to the responsibilities of oversight for the original Hastings design standards. What I'll do is I'll provide a quick summary of what those are. I know that many on the commission have a familiarity with these requirements. These are a set of ordinances that were established for historic areas of Hastings that are not on the historic register. Generally, we're looking at areas that are between 10th Street and the river, the railroad tracks over to Pine Street that are in that R2 zoning district. They've been around for probably 10, 15 years or so. What they do is they have some regulation on exterior renovations to the outside, as well as have some effect on new construction as well. What we're asking tonight with the amendment is to have the responsibility for these codes be transferred from the Planning Commission to the Heritage Preservation Commission. Now, the reason for that is the Heritage Preservation Commission is more familiar in regulating design guidelines, and they do much more work and have a greater familiarity with structures within these areas. So we thought it would be best to have them take ownership of this. When we had originally proposed these ordinance changes and adopted those into the code, because we put them in the zoning code and the Planning Commission is responsible for the zoning code, that's where they ended up lying. So it has nothing to do with any sort of slight in responsibility by this commission, certainly. We've certainly had our share of buildings that have gone forward for review, and we've been thankful for the comments and the review that you've given in the past on this one. But we do feel that the Heritage Preservation Commission would be a better fit for the regulation of these. So we're not asking for any change to the code itself, or to the ordinance amendment. The regulations, that's the word I'm getting at. The regulations themselves. The regulations would stay the same. The only thing that changes is instead of the Planning Commission being involved in areas that require their involvement, it would be the Heritage Preservation Commission on this. So we had the Planning Committee of City Council review this as well on November 4th, and they were in general agreement with the change as well. So I can stand for any questions, and again, this is a public hearing if you'd like to open that up at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I'll open the public hearing. If anybody would like to speak on this, please come up to the podium.
For the record, again, West Lund, 120 7th Street East, Hastings. This just, I wasn't planning on this because I didn't know this was coming about. And I am in the historic district, and I'm a contributing home, and I've had to go to the commission a couple of times to get some things done. I'm a little disturbed that this is the way things go down with these kinds of changes, particularly in a historic home. We bought the home knowing we were going to have to do this. But I'm starting to wonder where's the city's sense about history? I feel like we've outlived the lifespan of our historic home. I've even wondered if the Historic Preservation Committee is even valid anymore in our town. What are we trying? Are we still trying to preserve things or not? And I mean, I'm just kind of going random here because I don't have any prep because I didn't know you were going to talk about this tonight, and it's really frustrating. It's really frustrating. Owning a historic home in this town is not easy. I've been to some of the meetings where people have been really pissed off because the commission itself was not up to speed on some of the newer materials that are available for historic homes. I know a person who couldn't change his cedar shakes because he wanted to put a composite material on that looked more historic than the cedar shakes. And it's kind of like, well, what's the deal with that? Are you not watching this old house anymore? It's kind of like, so I'm a little concerned about this going that direction because you say they know these homes, but some of them are stuck in certain understandings of what it means to have an older home and what kind of materials to be used. And I mean, we had some heartburn about the material we used in replacing our windows because as far as they were concerned, they know wood and they know vinyl. Well, there's composites that have come down the market now. And some were finally able to be educated, and we got that cleared. But I wouldn't be just so settled that this is the right direction or the right place. I'm assuming that if this gets assigned to them, there's still the opportunity to appeal to like the council or to someone else if we have an issue that we can't get approved with one of the commissions. So there you go. Those are the random thoughts from an unprepared citizen.
No problem. Thank you, Mr. Lund. I could address a couple of those here. With the original Hastings design standards, these are different from what the Heritage Preservation Commission guidelines are for historic homes. When you're taking a look at what the HPC normally reviews, and Justin knows a lot more about this than I do, that you're looking at very specific materials on the outside of a home. With these standards here, we're not looking at a specific time period, we're not looking at the specific materials, we're looking for general form more than anything else. So it's a much more, it's not as detailed of a review on that. The other thing that's different on this one is these are not historically designated homes or districts. These are areas that are outside of those. So these do not affect areas that are on the register or within designated districts. These are the homes outside of them, correct? Okay. And so the other thing with this is with the Heritage Preservation Commission, any review that they do, they're generally the last party that looks at it. With original Hastings design standards, the Planning Commission has served as a review body. Council makes the final decision. That would be the same case here with the HPC. So the HPC would review it, City Council would make a final decision to approve it.
And I'd like to just comment on the HPC and alternate materials. I can't comment on any hearsay you heard with the HPC in a past case. Their main concern is loss of historic fabric. So the first thing they look at is, does the material need to be removed from the house? And the second is what the proposal does to the appearance. They routinely approve alternate materials of every type of material for houses. Composite windows, fiberglass posts, cementatious siding, as long as it meets the original appearance, they would approve it. If somebody was proposing some prefab shakes that were a different style or different shape or size, they wouldn't approve those. But if they replicated the design of the original material, they certainly would and do approve it. At least that's been my experience from working with the HPC for the past 12 years.
Thank you, Justin.
Hi, Miyoshi Sito, 315 Pine Street. And my question is, why does that only apply to properties outside of the historic district? Like, what is the difference? Why would it only be those specific ones?
Because the properties that are in the historic district are reviewed already by the HPC, and so there's no reason to have two different boards reviewing them.
Okay.
So if you're in the district, or if you're designated as historic, like 315 Pine Street, it doesn't have to go through this process because it's already going through a different process.
Okay. Yeah, that was my only question.
Okay.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, everyone, for being so inviting and kind to us, as we are new to Hastings. Thank you.
Thank you and welcome. Any other comments? If not, we'll close the public hearing. Commissioners, do you have any questions or comments for John?
Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Best.
I do have one question. So by this changing to the Heritage Preservation Commission, does that completely take it out of our hand, not our hands, but necessarily our viewing with anything that would come across with this stuff, or would we still see anything come across the board for us to view when it concerns stuff like this?
Sure. With this ordinance change, the Planning Commission would no longer be responsible for reviewing anything for original Hastings design standards. So no, nothing would come forward to you anymore.
Okay, thank you.
I've got a question, but it's just a general question about the committee itself, this, I don't even know, or the OHDS. So is there different criteria for building requirements in this district than the rest of the city? Obviously, there must be.
Right. You know, when you take a look at the city itself, we have our zoning code in which the requirements for land use are throughout the city. Within the zoning code, we have this specific area within the R2 zoning district in which the original Hastings design standards apply. And within this area, it doesn't affect areas that are designated historic sites. So it gets to be a little bit confusing on that, I know. But when you take a look at the level of review, anything that's designated as a historic site, that's on the registers locally, nationally, you know, that has the most specific review on it. HPC has that responsibility already. When the original Hastings design standards were established, they were meant to kind of, for lack of a better word, be an HPC light. You know, this would be for areas that are historic in nature, not designated historic, but we wanted to take a look at some general form type of issues. And so that's generally what the purpose of the district has been.
You just have had a resident call, just was upset about a neighbor, you know, and the design of the house, and it was a new construction house from nothing to the house, and I had no idea, I don't know, I gotta look this up because I don't know the different criteria, but that house that he was so upset about, you know, like went to the ends of every lot line. And it's just like the house and the garage fill up that lot to the setbacks. And he's like, how could this ever have come into the same neighborhood when every other house in the neighborhood is like the old school dynamics? And so it must be pretty liberal.
Yeah, and
for it to
Commissioner,
look
yeah.
like that.
Yeah, Commissioner, if you have any specific questions on that, I can certainly answer those after the meeting as well.
The setbacks are the same as the rest of the city?
Yeah, you know, the setbacks we have for different zoning districts, so it can depend on which district it's in.
Okay, so if it's an R2, it's,
Right.
yeah. It just sticks out very vividly in the neighborhood as being very different from every other house.
Okay.
So I would have suspected that things would have been a little bit different under this than the rest of the city. But I'll look it up. Thank you.
Commissioners, any other comments or questions? Otherwise, we'll take a motion.
Make a motion.
Commissioner Johnson.
Well, how do I state this? Amend the city code by chapter 155 regarding the original Hastings district standards. Adopting the ordinance amendment, I would move to adopt it, approve it.
Okay, we have a motion on the floor. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
We have a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes.
And this will follow the same system as the other ordinance amendment. City Council will review the first reading of this and order the public hearing on the 16th of December. There's no public discussion scheduled for that meeting. The public hearing and the ordinance adoption would take place on January 6th.
Thank you. The next item on the agenda is the election of Planning Commission Chair and Vice Chair.
Yep.
Before I open up for nominations, do you have any comments or anything you want to say?
Sure, I can provide a little bit of direction on this here. So within our ordinance of regulating planning commission responsibilities, in the December prior to the next year, we have elections for our planning commission chair and planning commission vice chair. The only requirements for serving in that position are that the individual must have served at least 1 year on the planning commission, so I think that is everyone here that's present. When we take a look at the responsibilities or the positions right now, as you know, we've had council member or Commissioner Elpa serving in the position. As chair, he will be leaving the commission at the end of this year. This will be his last meeting. And as well as Commissioner Barss as well, as the vice chair. He will also be leaving at the end of this year as well. So we have openings for both the chair and the vice chair for this commission. So the way this has normally been handled is the chair can accept motions and nominations for one or both of those positions, and I'll leave it open for discussion. Thank you.
With that, we can open it up for nominations for, do we do both at once or one at a time?
Leave it up to your discretion.
All right, we'll do the chairman first. Council chair, do I have any
I'd like to
nominations?
nominate Mitch Johnson for the chair.
We have a nomination of Mitch Johnson. Any other nominations? Hearing no further nominations, the nominations are closed. We have a nomination of Mitch Johnson for commissioner, for chairman of the planning commission. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Thanks. Now we'll open it up for vice chair.
I'll ask next
We
time.
have a nomination for vice chair.
I guess I'd nominate Ian Martin for vice.
We have a nomination on the floor for Ian Martin for vice chair. Do we have another nomination? Seeing no other, I'll close nominations.
And then ask for a second for that too, please.
Okay,
If there'd be a second to that one.
we have a second.
Can it come from us, or?
Say that again?
Sure.
Us on the way out?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, I'll second that.
We have a second. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? I'm sorry, there is no opposed.
Okay.
There's no opposed.
All right. Well, thank you very much. So I guess that goes to my next area of business here, and we'll have 2 new commissioners coming up beginning of 2016. This should be our last meeting, although we do have one scheduled for the 23rd. I will do my best not to hold that meeting. So that being the case here, I want to thank Brian and Rob for their service to the commission over the past number of years. I think Brian's been on here for over 6. Rob's been on the commission now, 3-4 years, I think. They've both provided great leadership, great insight. Rob, bringing his development experience to the table, has been very insightful in the applications we've looked at. Brian has provided some very steady leadership in serving as chair, and has always brought forward very thoughtful suggestions. And so I'm thankful for their service, wish them best in the future, and we should have 2 new planning commissioners starting at the beginning of January next year. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
And that's all. I think the only other business I had there was just an update on city council activities. The variance request for signage that we looked at the November meeting was ultimately approved by the city council, so they did take similar action to the commission on that item. Other than that's all I have.
I have one question. Before, last question is there any update on the building over here, the Hudson building?
Oh, sure. Yeah, with the Confluence building right now, ownership transferred March of last year. There's been a lot of interior environmental work going on the last couple of months on that one. We've gone through and put in what we term a vapor intrusion mitigation system, which basically sucks out soil vapor out through the roof. That's probably 80% installed within the building. We're starting a contract now where they're going to be doing some scraping of hazardous paint materials and encapsulation of those. That'll be going on the next few months. They've done a lot of demolition within the building itself, taking apart old pipes, fixing some of the water intrusion issues, doing a lot of work on the park. So when you take a look at the project itself, they need to be what's termed substantially completed by December 15th of 2020, and I think they're on track to do so. So when we take a look at what that project will look like this time next year, we should have a complete building, which would be great.
Sounds great. Thank you. Was there some landscaping deadlines or some grant money, or how did they made the deadlines?
Yeah, there was about $980,000 for outdoor activities, landscaping, grading, the deck that's out there. I think they'll just make that one there. There's some materials that they will be paying out of pocket in the spring, probably primarily landscaping material related, but there was a lot of other activities within the site that they were able to complete.
Commissioners, any other comments? If not, we'll take a motion to adjourn.
I just want to echo John, thank you guys for your service. Public service is not easy, and volunteer public service is sometimes even less easy, so appreciate it. And I'll make a motion to adjourn.
We have a motion, a second? I'll second that. We have a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
We are adjourned.
Thanks.